Before starting my regular introductions, I do want to take a brief moment to thank our outstanding ITS staff for all of their help this entire academic year. And also Marcom for getting the Bergren forums posted up onto YouTube as well. So with that, good afternoon and welcome to the Alfred University Bergren Forum. My name is John D'Angelo and I'm a professor of chemistry and the coordinator and host for the spring 2025 season of the Bergren Forum. This is episode 13, the season finale. Today's date is Thursday, March 1st, and for those of you attending the forum online here in Western New York, it is a beautiful, sunny, and comfortable day, and inside Nevins Theater of the Powell Campus Center, it is cozy and the coffee and tea are hot and free. And for this week only, we have cookies. Before starting, we have a few announcements. There is no Bergren Forum next week. Next week is finals. Senior shows will take place next Saturday, May 10th, starting at 4 p.m. I'd say where, but it will basically be all over campus with Binns, Merrill, and Harder Halls being the highest concentration of the shows. Come see Sharit Westreek's movement-based senior capstone performance, Undercurrent, today at 7:30 and tomorrow, May 2nd at 6 p.m. in the C.D. Smith Theater. Also tomorrow in Miller at 7:30, there will be a student chamber music concert, as well as the opening of the first-year SDS graduate cohort show at the Alfred Town Hall from 7 until 9 p.m. Come see the artwork of Louisa Sanders, Brian Walker II, Brian Latchman, Hollow Geffert, and Chris Lee. Like others, the Pop Ensemble will hold their spring concert on May 3rd at 7:30 in Miller. The opening reception for Ben and I will be at 5 p.m. on May 3rd, and the exhibit will stay open in the Cohen Gallery until May 6th. Other art shows on the 3rd include Ali Bruno's Little Death at the Celadon Terracotta Building, Sophie Gibson's The Mind's Eye in the Fosdick Nelson Gallery, and Cameo Chambers' Ceci n'est pas mon corps, that is, This Is Not My Body, on the catwalk of the Robert Turner Gallery, all opening at 6 p.m. The Corsairs, along with Boy Glitter, will have a concert May 3rd at 5 p.m. at the Village Bandstand. Come enjoy great music and get some merch. Follow on Instagram at _Corsairs, that's CORSAIRS_official. Finally, we celebrate today the series finale of Emrys Westcott's outstanding career at Alfred University, thus the cookies. Emrys has been a longtime supporter of the Bergren Forum through his many years at Alfred, be it with the late Professor Bill DeBrell, on his own, or with myself. Emrys has organized the Bergren Forum for well over a decade. Without Emrys' steady hand while we were all in the online land of COVID jail, we may not have a Bergren Forum today. Through the years, Emrys not only arranged for compelling and thought-provoking speakers, he also adapted to the growing digitalization of the world, and under his leadership and through the outstanding help of our amazing ITS and Marcom team, the Bergren Forum now has a regular presence on the Alfred University YouTube channel. To commemorate these years of service, Beth Van Dolby and I, with the help of Garrett McGowan, arranged with Jim Whiteman of the Alfred University Woodshop to create this little commemorative gift for you, Emrys. The decals were created and affixed to it by Ann Rossington, our chemistry lab manager. On behalf of Alfred University and the greater Alfred community, thank you, Emrys, for these years of dedication. Now, everyone, please imagine a great big applause sign behind me being lit up. And while you all clap, I'll bring this down to Emrys, since I'm confident that there's absolutely little to no chance that I can convince you to come up here to take it. And so without further ado, today's forum will be given by Johnny Molyneaux, Alfred University Senior. The title of the talk is Conflict and Justice, Contextualizing Contemporary Indonesia. Take it away, Johnny.
I need to figure out how to turn on this microphone. Check. Is it good? All right, perfect. Yeah, I just wanted good. I apologize if I cough. I managed to get a scratch in my throat right before this. So I'll work through it. Okay. Indonesia, once the victim of colonialism, oppression, and exploitation, are also themselves culprits of the same crimes, either from the Portuguese, the Dutch, or the Japanese. The violence that others imposed onto Indonesia, the Indonesians would go on to impose on others. This presentation will be looking at the development of Indonesian identity, specifically through the lens of oppression. To understand the relationship of Indonesia with oppression, I want to quickly go over Iris Young's 5 faces of oppression, which are exploitation, marginalization, powerlessness, cultural imperialism, and violence. The explanations are not meant to define the words, but instead provide a context to how the words are used. I believe this is a clicker. Exploitation refers to the exploitation of workers for underpaid labor, or it can also refer to the exploitation of workers for resources. Marginalization refers to the expulsion of a group of people from participating in society. This expulsion is very closely tied to the deprivation of material goods from that group. The powerless are those who lack the power or authority for self-governance. In the context of her writing, Young is referring explicitly to the class struggle of the working class in the United States and their lack of autonomy in the workplace, as well as their agency relative to an educated class. But in the context of this presentation, we won't necessarily be looking at economic classes, but instead comparing political classes and looking at the relationship of a dominant class relative to the subjected class. Cultural imperialism refers to the power dynamics between two groups, which establishes the dominance of one shared experience over another. Lastly, violence refers to the use of violence to either establish or maintain one's dominance over another. Do this. Oops, I did it the wrong way. Indonesia. I did. There we go. I was right. Indonesia is often seen as being homogeneous, a single nation with a single people. But it's not quite that simple. In actuality, there are 300 separate ethnic groups and over 1,400 sub-ethnic groups in the over 922 permanently inhabited islands. The different groups that now make up Indonesia were once all part of separate kingdoms, but with the introduction of Islam to the region, they slowly became more connected. Sometime between 644 to 656, traders from the third caliph of Islam were believed to have traveled through the region, trading with local kingdoms on their way to China. This provides the first signs of Arabic influence into the region. However, it's not until around 1297 when we know that Islam had taken hold in the northern parts of Sumatra, then spreading to northeast Malay, Brunei, and southern Philippines. For the time being, Islam would remain a religion of the aristocracy, while the general population still practiced varying local religions. Initially, regions like Central Java and East Java were still very hostile to Islam, but it would eventually spread there as well, but fundamentally very different. Until the 16th century, Islam would only very loosely connect the varying kingdoms, but with the introduction of the Europeans, Islam would become more ingrained in the local identity as a means of establishing themselves as being within the in-group. And over time, Islam's role in local identity would strengthen, and by World War II, would become a fully fledged political force. The first introduction of Europeans came in 1510, when Diego Lopes Siqueira was sent by the Portuguese to set up a trade relationship with the Kingdom of Malacca. At first, he was welcomed, but that quickly changed. So in April 1511, the Portuguese sent Afonso de Albuquerque, who would forcibly insert the Portuguese and introducing a new scale of violence to the region, along with Portuguese weapons. The Portuguese would eventually leave, abandoning their outpost in the process, but not before creating a demand for Southeast Indies spices in the Netherlands. And the Dutch would pick up where the Portuguese left off, sending their first expedition in 1596. Despite severe mismanagement, like the ships not going to the actual Spice Islands, they would still return to the Netherlands with a healthy profit, which proved that, quote, even an incompetent voyage could make money. And this marked the beginning of the Wildvaart, or the wild, unregulated voyage. In 1599, Jacob van Neck would lead one of 5 separate voyages that would leave for the Spice Islands of Maluku, returning to the Netherlands with a 400% profit. In 1602, the competing voyage companies would all merge together to form the United East Indies Company, or as we know it, the VOC. Under the VOC, the Dutch would be better organized and better able to force monopoly agreements with local kingdoms. From this point on, we begin to see the Dutch playing a more active role in local politics, helping kingdoms loyal to the Dutch and supporting rivals of disloyal kingdoms, all with the goal of consolidating their power in the region. By the beginning of the 20th century, the Dutch had successfully consolidated their control. And between the kind of 16th century and the 20th century, the main focus had been consolidating. And so we see a repeat of kind of the same acts. And the earliest 20th century would be considered the peak of Dutch colonial power. But as a response to the extent of Dutch control, we would also begin to see the politicization of Islam as a form of resistance. In 1906, a program was created to, quote, elevate Javanese people through the study of Western knowledge and of their own cultural heritage. And in 1912, Sarakat Islam, the first politically based nationalist organization, would form, with the distinct goal of achieving full governance. Through the 1920s, we also see the rise of a lot of independence-based political parties. But the most important ones that we need to remember are the Communist Parties of the Indies, or the PKI, who we'll return to later, and the Indonesian Nationalist Party, the PNI, who were created in 1927. The creation of the PNI coincides with the rise of a young Sukarno, a natural orator whose speeches could command the respect of intellectuals while also appealing to the masses. He would lead the party to stardom and eventually be the first president of a united Indonesia. However, his rise to the presidency would not be until much later. For now, he would just lead the PNI. That is until December 29th, when Sukarno, along with 7 other PNI leaders, would all be arrested for subversion and attempting to overthrow the government. He would be released early in December of 1931, but would be arrested again in 8 months, this time being banished. Sukarno, a symbol of the Indonesian struggle for independence, is still in exile, but the struggle for Indonesian independence continues. During this time, there have been several attempts to form constituency groups, but the largest and most important was the Federation of Indonesian Political Parties, or GAPI, which formed in 1939. They were able to unite eight of the most important nationalist organizations who all represented varying interests and priorities in Indonesian independence. And they were able to get them all to agree on four key principles: the right of self-determination for Indonesia, national unity founded upon political, economic, and social democracy, a democracy elected in Indonesian parliament responsible to the people of the people of Indonesia, and solidarity between Indonesian political groups and the Netherlands in order to maintain a strong anti-fascist front. This is, of course, in the context of happening right before World War II. GAPI was also successful in ratifying Indonesian as the official language and creating an official demand for self-determination. However, this progress would be overshadowed by the German annexation of the Netherlands, resulting in the exile of the Dutch Queen to England in 1940 and the subsequent Japanese annexation of Indonesia in 1942. The Dutch weren't really concerned with the well-being of the Indonesian subjects that were now under Japanese control. In fact, newspapers and articles from this time were largely focused on the frozen assets and frozen bank accounts or the frozen investments that the Dutch investors could not access. These frozen investments is the closest we actually get to the mention of the people in Indonesia. And even in this context, they're referred to as an investment. Later on, as the war continued, gaining back control of Indonesia was not a matter of freeing the native populations. At least for the Dutch, it was a matter of inconveniencing the Japanese as a way of getting back at them but costing them profits. The reason that I bring this up is because this exemplifies the relationship of the Dutch to the Indonesian people. They were simply a commodity and a resource to be exploited. When the Japanese came and the Dutch fled, they took Sukarno with them. Now, Sukarno alleges that this was so that he couldn't be used as by the Japanese as an anti-Dutch propaganda tool. In actuality, he never actually left Indonesia. He was just fled to a different section. This was likely hubris on his own part. However, he was in fact later on used as an anti-Dutch propaganda tool, and because of it, considered a Japanese collaborator. But again, this reality isn't that simple. See, the Japanese methods of oppression were less blatant, but still prominent. Although they did use violence and threats of violence, they depended much more heavily on manipulation. Ganda Subrata, who lived in Central Java at the time, provided a first-hand account of the Japanese occupation. In it, he details the efforts of the Japanese military to Japanize the population as a form of subjugation. Through methods like forcing schools to run on Japanese school schedules and enforcing Japanese spirit, which quite literally meant forcing the population to adopt a Japanese mindset at the threat of violence. He also explains that although the Japanese were friendly to the working class, it was only so that they could garner support of the workers, so that the Japanese could recruit them either for cheap labor or recruit them to the military. And especially towards the end of the war, they heavily recruited local populations into joining the Japanese volunteer defense force, called Defenders of the Homeland, or PETA for short, to defend against an imminent Allied invasion. In the administration of Indonesia, the Japanese military locked up any remaining Dutch into internment camps. and forced them to pay foreign European registration fees with the new Japanese war currency. There was also additional fees and taxes that were higher for men, and especially European men, than their Asian counterparts. This represented a shift. Where the Dutch were once the oppressor, they were now the oppressed. Meanwhile, the Japanese pushed the narrative of helping Indonesian independence for the goal of Pan-Asianism, or in other words, a united Asia where all cultures would be respected as equals. Of course, this came with the subtext that Asia would be united and all cultures would be free, as long as those cultures were Japanese. According to Sukarno, quote, "The Dutch tempered their mastery with fake benevolence, the Japs did not." On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. And on the 15th, Japan surrendered unconditionally, which now set a new problem for the Indonesian nationalists. Quote, "Because there had been no Allied reconquest of Indonesia, there was now a political hiatus. The Japanese were still in control, but surrendered, and no Allied forces were present to replace them. Plans for orderly Japanese-sponsored independence seemed to now have come to a halt, and by the following day, they had received specific orders to hold the status quo until the Allied forces could arrive. Earlier, while the Dutch had retreated and their queen was in exile, they had made vague promises of reforms, but the vague promises were met fairly skeptically, as it was largely a promise to deal with their problems later, once the Dutch came back to power, which possibly meant that waiting for Allied forces could mean a return to the status quo. So, on August 17th, 1945, Sukarno, outside of his home, read out the Declaration of Independence. And soon after, a government was formed based out of Jakarta, with Sukarno as president and Hatta as vice president. This new government would be forced to deal with the excitement of revolution which had swept the nation, especially among the youth, who in September had taken over a train station in Jakarta. However, this would not be all of their problems. In around October, Allied forces arrived in Indonesia to accept the Japanese surrender, but this only created more tension. The Japanese soldiers, who up to this point had largely been ignoring the revolution, were now obligated to take back control of the towns and cities where they had lost control. In early October, a series of events resulted in a conflict that saw 500 Japanese soldiers and 2,000 Indonesians dead. The city of Surabaya would become a national symbol of resistance. On October 25th, 6,000 British Indian troops were sent to Surabaya to liberate the city. This would result in another conflict that ended on November 10th, with British soldiers sweeping through the city with air and naval bombardments. At the end of this, 6,000 Indonesians lay dead and thousands more were evacuated. Fighting and violence in Indonesia would go on well after the war had ended. And it would not be until July of 1949 that a ceasefire agreement would be signed, in December when the Dutch would recognize Indonesian sovereignty. Indonesia, for the first time in 400 years, was now free, but still not quite united. Indonesia, under the early parliamentary system, would be largely ineffective and short-lived. One of the biggest issues of the parliamentary system, or the Indonesia's liberal democracy period, was it failed to resolve factionalism that had enveloped the country during the revolution. For years, while different factions existed, they had largely been classified together by the Dutch and then the Japanese. And compared to the out group, the differences were relatively small. But without the Dutch or Japanese to unite against, infighting between the factions broke out. So, in 1959, Sukarno took the reins of the Indonesian democracy, starting the period known as Sukarno's guided democracy. In this, Indonesian democracy would revert back to the 1945 constitution and would more or less closely align to the Javanese feudalist system. Sukarno, during his presidency, would largely be remembered or be considered as a revolutionary idealist and would be remembered for his ability to get different factions that hated each other to work together. In fact, he made this a core part of his power structure. Known as his 3 pillars of power, these pillars were made up by the communist or the PKI, which we had learned about earlier, and they would be his strongest pillars of support, the Muslim fundamentalists, and the army, using the 3 pillars as a way to put a check on each of their own powers. But even under his rule, Indonesia would still be rattled with issues. Although Sukarno's personal relationship with the American president John F. Kennedy was friendly, his relationship with the United States was tentative at best. The United States, on numerous occasions, had accused Sukarno of being a communist. And I suspect this was largely in part due to Sukarno's outspokenness against imperialism and European colonialism. And by the 1960s, his pillars would crumble. You would see tensions between the PKI and the army growing. Muslimists were politically weak, meaning that they could no longer check the powers of the PKI and army. Sukarno was losing support of the PKI and the Muslimists, and most importantly, the army wanted more power in domestic politics. To make tensions worse, leftist officers who had attempted a coup in the military. In response, General Suharto began a purge of the communists, mainly targeting Central and East Java, where the PKI support was the strongest, but also extending the purges into northern Sumatra and Bali. At the end of this all, Suharto likely killed 300 to 400,000, with the largest estimates being over 1 million. For Suharto, his pillars of checks and balances were dead. With no communist faction and no significant Muslimist faction, there was no one left to check the powers of the army. And as a result, the army would grow increasingly bold. On March 11th, Suharto would instigate a riot in Jakarta, encouraging students to, quote, create an atmosphere of chaos in the capital. Anti-Sukarno demonstrators would eventually make their way to the presidential palace, and this was followed by some unidentified soldiers, which forced Sukarno to flee by helicopter. Now, likely coerced, Sukarno met with Suharto and signed the Supermar, or letter of March 11th, 1966, which assigned Suharto to, quote, take all measures considered necessary to guarantee security, calm, and stability to the government. With this, Suharto blamed the communists for the instability and officially bans them. Later, Sukarno tries to undo Supermar, but is unsuccessful. Suharto now has not just eliminated his only political rival, but also taken the seat of power, and officially taking the seat in March of 1967. Coming into power, Suharto would immediately begin consolidating his power. Suharto would implement Dwi Fungsi, which would establish the dual role of the military, both as the military, but domestically in policing and a role in the parliamentary system. He would officially declare Golkar the parliamentary branch of the, he would officially declare Golkar, which was the parliamentary branch of the military, as the official policy arm of his administration. And in the 1971 election, he would require a quota of votes in favor of Golkar. In 1973, he asked non-political parties to voluntarily dissolve and instead to join two new parties. The United Development Party, which was made to appeal to former Muslimist parties, and the Indonesian Democratic Party, which was made to appeal to former nationalist and Christian nationalist parties. In his efforts, he would force individuals who would not align to be on the same party, further crippling his opposition. Now, there's been a lot of information that I've thrown at you so far, so I think now is a good time for a recap on the development of Indonesian national identity, kind of through the lens of oppression. In the pre-colonial period, Islam was a cultural cachet that only very loosely united the Bergren kingdom. I mean, very loosely. With the introduction of the Europeans, that had begun to shift. People began to use Islam as a way of identifying themselves as being part of the in-group. And by World War II, would shift into a fully developed political force. The Dutch initially commandeered the Indonesian nationalism to carry an anti-fascist message for their war efforts. But when the Japanese came, they pushed for a pan-Asian identity that they saw all Asiatic experiences as equal, which, of course, with the caveat or with the implications of a Japanese cultural dominance. During the struggle for independence, the political focus shifted into an anti-imperial and anti-colonial message. And after the independence, different factions had fragmented the Indonesian people and were again divided. Sukarno reunified the country under a shared Indonesian experience, of course, with the implications of a Javanese cultural dominance. Now, this takes us back to 1966 when Suharto takes control. Pushing forward a couple years, coming into the 1970s, Suharto would largely have consolidated his power. Through his rule, Suharto had largely ruled with an iron fist, but in the process had brought about a lot of reforms. Suharto reformed the economy, bringing in foreign investments and paying off debts, as well as investing in and subsidizing roads, agriculture, and public facilities, like schools, hospitals, and religious centers. And as a result, the country prospered, and life expectancies skyrocketed. But this growth came at a cost. I think the best way to show the cost of this, of his rule, is to look at the Indonesian invasion of Timor-Leste. Here's my notes about Suharto's reform. Indonesia invaded Timor-Leste in December of 1975. But even well before then, he had been pushing the narrative of a Timorese hegemony with Indonesia, trying to push the population into rejecting Portugal and into rejecting self-sovereignty. Instead, to join Indonesia in a unified Southeast Asia, of course, with the implications of an Indonesian cultural dominance. Indonesia had brought instability into Timor-Leste and invaded under the guise of stabilizing the region, blaming the communists and promising to stop them. Although the Timorese knew that the invasion was coming, they were entirely unprepared for the scale and brutality of the invasion. The Indonesian soldiers were accompanied by bombardments from both air and ship artillery. And according to first-hand accounts, the soldiers had made no distinction between civilians and soldiers. As a survivor of the attacks noted, quote, the soldiers who landed started killing everyone they could find. There were dead bodies in the streets. All we could see were the soldiers killing, killing, killing. During the worst of the campaign in the 70s, the Indonesian government had been given OV-10 Broncos, a military aircraft by the US government. And according to some missionaries who were there during the time, about a third of the people they had met in rural villages had been killed. And according to Smith, there was also a large famine associated with the use of it. And by the end of the invasion in 1999, 200,000 Timoris lay dead and 240,000 more, about a third of the population, were left displaced. My goal in this presentation was to explain the complexity of Indonesia's relationship with the systems of oppression. While on one hand, it had united the country and propelled it forward, this progress came at a huge cost. I believe that it is important not only to approach systems at a macro level, which is to say this system resulted in this end result, but instead to take a more holistic approach, to examine not just the end results of a decision, but how the decisions affect people on the individual level. Thank you. And special thanks. Bergren.
What questions do we have for Johnny?
Oh,
Your worst fear.
yeah. So this is my dad. If
Okay.
so, as I should explain that.
You started out with that great map of Indonesia. But the story that you tell really focuses on what appears to be a real dominance of Java and Javanese, both politics and culture. And yet it's quite small compared to the rest of Indonesia. Can you give us a sense of why Java was so central?
Sure. So I mean, I think so. In the very early stages, in the kind of early introduction of Islam, Sumatra, which is the island on the very left, the very big one on the very left, was culturally dominant. But then we start to see shift. So we start seeing a political shift. And it's not so much, and there is some weakening of the kind of the kingdoms in Sumatra, but it's mainly just with the introduction of trade. No, during the introduction of the Europeans, and even slightly before then, Java really started to become more dominant because they really doubled down on trade early on. And so starting from then on, we really start seeing a political dominance of Java. And so the old capital of, I'm forgetting the name of it, but the old capital and now with the new capital, or the current capital of Jakarta, of Indonesia, Jakarta, are both on the island of Java. And so the reason this kind of history focuses around Indonesia, around Java, is because there is the cultural dominance of Java in Indonesian politics and history.
Please forgive if this question is totally ignorant of world religion, but it is my understanding of Islam and Japanese culture that they're not exactly 100% kind of, compatible with each other. And so I'm wondering if there was any pushback from the Islamic culture in Indonesia as the Japanese were trying to kind of force their culture on Indonesia.
Sure. By the time the Japanese came, I kind of go through this theme of there's a shift in the politics and the kind of the psyche of Indonesians, of being initially based in Islam and then expands to being outside of it. Because then as we reach the other islands, they're not necessarily all Muslim. From what I could, from what I've read, there wasn't really necessarily much mention of religious issues regarding kind of Islam and the Japanese occupation, though. But a big part is, again, the focus was on this political identity of Islam was what connected them together, but it was not just Islam, it was a regional identity as well.
Thank you. I have to pass him to get to you.
Great presentation, Johnny.
Thank you. Yep. I think, well, at least how he's normally seen, I'm trying to find that slide. So in the kind of history books, Sukarno is seen as kind of this being idealist, not necessarily very pragmatic, but he believes in the idea of the Indonesian revolution and the Indonesian people. And so I think his 3 pillars of support is both a combination of like pragmatic, let's get things done, but also a belief that Sukarno held that people with different ideas can get along and they can cooperate and work together. So I'm not sure if that helps, that answers your question, but.
Nice talk, Johnny.
Thank you.
I have an obvious perspective here that I think will become clear. But when I think of Indonesia, I think of really serious earthquakes and tsunamis.
Mhm.
Do those play any kind of role in this background of political unrest? You can say no.
No, not from what I
Fair
can
enough.
read, but. And actually, and I think to elaborate on that a little bit more, I think part of it is, it's one of those things of like, it's the fact of life where it's, we get, snow or hail here and it doesn't necessarily affect. I mean, yeah, and we get very bad storms, but it's, we get hurricanes and tornadoes, but it's never seen as like a cause of instability.
That was a great presentation. Thanks.
Thank
So a different kind of question from the volcano one. Can you talk about the effect like on daily life and availability of resources? Was it better during his guided democracy? Was it worse if I'm an average person?
Yeah, on the average person, Indonesia was still in kind of severe poverty, and and there was Indonesia was in severe poverty, and there was hyperinflation during the time of Sukarno's rule. And it's under Suharto, he kind of manages that and he wrangles everything together. Of course, again, with the implications of using force. And so it's this interesting dynamic. And I think you see this as well in other dictatorships where you see this great leap of progress, and there's some approval because they do improve the lives of, the people. Like you see this in Hungary, in Turkey. I took a class with Jeff, I don't know if he's in here, last year, and we were talking about, not the pros and cons of dictatorships, but the dynamics of dictatorships and the progress that they're able to bring, but at the cost of it, And so, yeah, Suharto had brought in a lot of progress and improved the lives of Indonesians compared to during Sukarno's rule.
Any others?
Yeah, this was great, Johnny. Thanks.
Thank you.
I have 2 questions for you. So how did you pick this topic? And could you talk to us just a little bit about your kind of research methodology? Like what did you do to find out all this information?
Yeah. So this is kind of pulled out of my undergraduate thesis that I've been working on with Jeff or Dr. Slider Beltrao since last semester. And so I started with kind of reading. I think how I originally started was looking at the Indonesia's current shift to authoritarianism right now. And as I started reading more about it, I started to kind of go back a little bit. And as I kept researching more, I kept going farther and farther and farther back. At one point, I got to the point when I was in, 300, the year 300. And I kind of went, okay, well, I think I went too far back. So I need to push back forward again. And so I, negotiated and got to around 600. So, but then, at that point, I started looking at the development of Indonesia from 600 to current. And I was noticing this theme, and I started reading this book. I'm forgetting, it's, Nationalism in Indonesia, I think is what it's called, by McCain. I want to say, I think I'm pronouncing the name right. Who talks about the development of nationalism, but he's kind of starts at the end of World War II. And he starts kind of around World War II. And I was going, well, hold on. There's a lot more before this as well, And so I've started connecting different books that I had already been reading. And then as I was writing it, I went, I don't like this. And so I scratched the whole thing and started over again and decided, well, I could kind of do, because at that point I was just kind of making bullet points of these are events in history. And then I started to look at, well, what's the theme here? And I realized the theme is the development of Indonesian national identity, right? And how that developed from loose kingdoms to, based on Islam, to developing past the Islamic identity to kind of a current day. And so this presentation only goes up to 1999, but there's a lot more as well. Was there a second question? Okay.
If there are no others, please join me in thanking Johnny, all of the other Bergren Forum speakers for the year, our outstanding ITS and Marcom people, ADI for the coffee, and of course, Emrys for an outstanding lineup.